So my name's Jeremy Palenchar. I'm a founding partner at Orcas Consulting. We're a Seattle-based consultancy focused mostly on Microsoft identity and security. But for those of you who have seen me speak before, I am not talking about FIM today. I am not talking about MIM today. We will not be looking at any code. We will not be doing any demos. So really what we're going to do is we're going to take kind of a high-level look at MFA, where we are today, where I think you as customers should be looking and investing and focusing. I really want to see some folks from the industry here. So how many people from Ping in the room? Nobody from Ping. Well, that's too bad. They're not going to get the message. How many from Duo? Nobody from Duo. They're not getting the message either. Okta? Nobody from Okta here today? All right. Well, I'm going to rely on you guys, the customers, and you guys, the system integrators, to push those vendors that I just mentioned to focus on MFA 2.0 and really stop thinking about MFA 1.0, because I think that's in the past. So I'm going to set a little bit of a baseline for us today. How many people here? Okay, so I'll start off talking about a little bit about NIST 863.3. I came to the Cloud Identity Summit last year. I saw Paul Grassi's talk on it, and it was really timely for me because I was working with a customer on their MFA project at the time. And I thought that there were a lot of really good insights in that talk. So if you're here in the room and you're familiar with 863.3 and you've read it, who here's read it? Awesome. Why do I like the NIST 863.3? Because my tax dollars, I'm guessing millions of them, were spent doing the research and the study to think about how do we create a secure authentication environment, mostly focused on government systems. But when I think about what's in that standard and how it was written, I really like to use it when I talk to my enterprise customers too, because the document, the standard really starts off with, let's do a risk assessment, right? Let's look at where, what risks we have, what data we're trying to protect, what things we're trying to do, and that risk assessment drives assurance level requirements. So let's look at how that happens, right? So I think that this is sort of a matrix. I've called out where it is in the standard. Down the left-hand side here, we can see impact categories. These impact categories are things for you to think about. Am I interested in how a breach or an exploit might cause an inconvenience to my standing or reputation? Sure. Do I want to end up on the front page of the New York Times? I don't think so. Am I worried about a financial loss or a liability financially? That could be whether somebody is hacking my API. That could be whether I'm under regulatory compliance and I'm going to get fined if I mess this thing up. By the way, the timer's not running, so I don't know how much time I've got left. Perfect. Thank you very much. The one that I've circled here in red is the one that I think we in the enterprise and in the consumer-facing world can really think about, right? In the world of GDPR, in the world of HIPAA, I think almost every enterprise, almost every organization, government, federal, commercial, financial, is probably worried about the unauthorized release of sensitive information, whether it be about your own internal data or about the data for your customers. And what NIST says is, if you are concerned about unauthorized release of sensitive information, then those systems should be protected at an assurance level of 2. Okay, so keep that in the back of your mind, assurance level 2. And we'll talk about how we get to assurance level 2, particularly through the use of identity proofing and MFA 2.0, right? So I think, like I said, I think most organizations, when they do that risk assessment for themselves, are going to say, at least for a decent portion of our population, we're going to be interested in assurance level 2. So NIST talks about three different kinds. NIST 63.3 talks about 3 different kinds of assurance levels. We're going to talk about 2 of them today. The other ones, you guys can go read the standard. It's excellent reading. So we're going to talk about identity assurance level, and we're going to talk about authenticator assurance level. So when we think about identity assurance levels, what are we talking about? We're talking about how do we know that the person on the other end of the phone is who they say they are, right? And in NIST, identity assurance level 1 is self-assertion. I say who I am, I provide you my email address, you send me a confirming email, I reply, Jeremy is jeremy@palenchar.net or jeremyp@orcasconsulting.com, and I am who I say I am. That's identity assurance level 1. Identity assurance level 2. This requires some sort of identity proofing. I'm extremely happy to see the number of vendors that are out there in the vendor area, the number of other talks that I've seen so far today where people are talking about identity proofing and bootstrapping. Because when I sit down and I talk to my geek friends about what's the problem with authentication in this world, what's the problem with MFA today, I think it's really a gap in identity proofing and being able to prove who you say you are, right? So NIST says to get an identity assurance level 2 you need to have either remote or in-person identity proofing, right? So when I did the health benefits exchange for the Commonwealth of Kentucky, the federal government said, if you want tax data, you have to do identity proofing. And we said, great, how do we do that? Well, go talk to Experian. They've got this remote identity proofing solution out there. And basically what it does is it asks you those what are called out-of-wallet questions. Have you ever lived on this street? Do you have a bank account with awesomebank.com, right? I think you guys are all familiar with these out-of-wallet questions and this remote identity proofing. Well, guess what? Experian got hacked. All of my out-of-wallet questions and all of your out-of-wallet questions are now in the hands of the hackers. So I'm going to stand here today and I'm going to argue to you that remote identity proofing isn't really possible today, right? Those tools and systems that we relied on just a few years ago aren't possible today. And then if we talk about identity assurance level 3, that's in-person identity proofing with certified and trained people. These are people who have the book of all the valid driver's licenses. They can tell what a US passport looks like, probably can tell what a Canadian and Mexican passport looks like. These are trained individuals who can do that identity proofing. So where I really think that identity assurance level comes in, we have kind of 2 different things here. We have what does it look like in the enterprise, and what does it look like in the commercial world, right? In the enterprise today, somebody says, oh, you need MFA to get your email. You need MFA to log into Salesforce. You need MFA to do something fun. Great. Try to log in, put in your username and password. Oh, you need MFA. Register your cell phone. Send a one-time code to your email. Well, that's not really identity proofing, right? Because all I needed to get that second factor registered and linked to my account was to provide my first factor, which was my username and password. So I think in the enterprise, right, we have a lot of ideas, or I have a lot of ideas about how we can do in-person identity proofing. We can mine all that data in our directory. We can find out who your boss is and who your coworker is, and we can simply say, send them a very complicated, cryptographically secure code and say, hey, next time you see Jeremy in the hall, hand him this code. He's going to need it to register his OTP device, right? Because my manager knows who I am. My coworker knows who I am. They can do that in-person identity proofing and provide me that bootstrap to securely register my device. Now, when we talk about commercial, it gets a little more difficult, right? How do you reach out to the other end of the internet and grab your customer and do an identity proofing and bring them into this ecosystem in a secure way? Well, I don't know. That's a much harder problem. I saw a couple products downstairs that look interesting, might be able to help out in this way. But this is identity assurance levels. So I'm going to take a break here. I've asked them to leave the lights up in the room so that I can see you guys. Any questions so far about NIST, why I like how my government spent my tax dollars, or about identity assurance levels? We got one right here.
So I'd like to debate you.
Perfect.
Remote ID proofing is dead for now.
Uh-huh.
I don't agree.
Okay, I appreciate that. I appreciate that. I think I've given my argument. You want to give me 5 seconds,
yeah.
and then we'll move on?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, great.
So you base that on the assumption that the identity proofing is done through knowledge base, out-of-wallet questions.
Like I said, historically, that's how it's been done.
Historically,
and
that
that's
is.
the one that I think that we have a problem. I did mention that there are a couple of great companies downstairs who have other ideas in this area.
Right.
Do you work for one of them?
No,
Okay,
well,
good.
I do work for one, but not downstairs.
Okay.
Yeah, we're not that big that we could come here, except for me. So because there is remote identity proofing without doing the out-of-wallet or in-wallet or whatever knowledge-based questions, so you can do remote ID proofing. And in fact, the NIST 800-63, which is great reading, as you said,
yeah.
Actually points out that that's not the right vehicle for this.
Perfect. So we agree that out-of-wallet questions are MFA 1.0, and then we're going to move on to some newer and better techniques. Thank you. All right, so we talked about identity assurance levels. Let's talk about authenticator assurance levels, right? So how do we get to authenticator assurance level 2 as specified by NIST, right? So it says, well, it's basically multi-factor authentication. So we're not talking about two-factor authentication, we're talking about multi-factor authentication. And in my world of MFA 2.0, multi-factor is something you know and something you have. So we'll talk about some other ideas that people have about other factors here in a second, but let's focus really on something that you know and something that you have. So over on the left-hand side, you have what I consider to be sort of traditional multi-factor authentication. You've got a strong memorized password, right? That's something that you know. And there's something that you have, right? So we can use things like one-time recovery passwords that are so long that it's no longer something that you know, it's something that you have to carry around on a little card with you. Something that's near and dear to my heart and the bane of any vendor I've talked to, which are these little grid cards that say go to column A and grab a letter and go to column row C and grab a letter, and we'll talk about why that's the bane of my existence, and maybe in a little bit. You can have a single-factor OTP device, so that's something that, like my little PayPal keychain, I push a button, it uses a cryptographic algorithm to generate a one-time password. I can put that in. I could have a single-factor cryptographic software, something that like what's running on your phone right now. Google Authenticator generates a code every 60 or 120 seconds. Single-factor cryptographic device. I'm sure we can come up with a good example there. Or what we could have is we could have a device that combines those two things together, right? So I know RSA used to be really big. They had an OTP device that also required a PIN, right? So before it would show you the OTP, you had to put in a PIN. So that's sort of like this multi-factor OTP with PIN, multi-factor cryptographic software. It won't show you the code until you put in your PIN. I put an asterisk up there with OTP with PIN because to remind me and to remind you guys that NIST says having a PIN on your cell phone to lock your OTP is not really kosher, right? So, I mean, sure, if you're using MDM and you've got a really good convincing argument that there's a strong PIN on that device, Maybe for you guys that'll work. But in general, simply having a PIN lock on your phone isn't good enough to get that sort of level 2. You still need some kind of a strong password, right? So that's Authenticator Assurance Level 2 for NIST. So in my mind, NIST is really clear about biometrics aren't quite there yet, right? So I think we saw some interesting presentations last year, if you were here, that talk about, well, we're going to use things like your cadence or how you get to your office every day or how close your cell phone is to all your friends to do some of these things like risk assessments or some biometric authentication. I think that the number of false positives are too high and false negatives are even higher for biometrics. So we're going to say that's MFA 3.0, right? We'll be talking about MFA 3.0 in a couple of years, and you guys are going to be demanding that from your vendors in a couple of years, because in that case, it's going to be something you have and something you are, and it's going to be awesome. It's going to be like that keynote last night. The password's going to be gone, right? So, SMS, email OTP, Paul Grassi came last year from NIST and did this inspirational talk, at least for me, and I think for a lot of the vendors that I've seen downstairs, and said, we almost said SMS is deprecated, right? But we pulled back. Well, SMS is deprecated, right? Who went to the session last night on SMS vulnerabilities? A few of you. I think he gave a couple good examples of why we don't want to rely on SMS. I think email OTPs, even worse, right? Email in and to itself is not a great transport mechanism for secure things, right? So we're going to call that MFA 1.0. So if you as consultants and integrators and customers are out there and you're shopping for MFA solutions and somebody comes to you and says, we're going to send your customer an SMS, you're going to say no. That's MFA 1.0, right? I went to Jeremy's talk in Boston right before that great baseball game, and he told me that I'm only allowed to, this guy said great baseball game, all of a sudden he's got a question. Great, so he said do not buy MFA 2.0, right? So we got a quick question here?
Yeah, so I don't disagree.
Uh-huh.
But how do you handle users that don't have mobile devices?
Perfect. This guy wants to know how to handle users that don't have mobile devices. That's a great question. I had that question too. We're going to get there in just a second. Okay, perfect. So, just setting the baseline here. MFA 2.0. It's not SMS. It's not email OTP. That's 1.0. It's not biometrics and WebAuth. That's 3.0. There's great sessions coming right after mine to talk about MFA 3.0. and the future and what you should be demanding your vendors and your customers and your standards groups to do in the future. It's also not 2FA, right? Something you know and something else you know, like these knowledge-based questions, password recovery. That's not MFA. I think there are great cases for 2FA, right? If you want assurance level 1 and you're only seeing your own data and you're not really interested in stronger security, I think 2FA is probably good enough, right? This session is about MFA 2.0, right? Something you have and something that you know. So let me tell you about this customer that I was working with last year when I came to the conference and I saw this great talk. Large retail organization, right? Probably good enough to have assurance level 1 for their standard users who work in their retail stores. They're checking their email, they're checking the internet portal, they're only going to see data about themselves. We have assurance level 2 kinds of risks and requirements for our back office users, sysadmins who need to log in and do administrative privilege tasks, right? Access to financial systems, access to large amounts of aggregated customer data, pharmacy users who have access to health HIPAA data. Probably, but maybe not, assurance level 3 requirements for the C-suite. People who work in finance, they're borrowing millions of dollars a day. transferring millions of dollars a day through ACH. We might want to have a stronger assurance for those guys, right? Going to this gentleman's question right over here, it's a retail organization. They're in California. It's the largest state in the nation. California says, I'm not allowed to require my employees to carry a cell phone. It's retail. They're certainly not going to give each one of their employees a cell phone. That's cost prohibitive, right? We have other use cases like the pharmacy. Can't have a cell phone in the pharmacy because it might be used to capture and transmit health information, right? So we have some use cases like this gentleman talks about. What happens if you need strong MFA, you need MFA 2.0, but you can't require that cell phone? Let's go back to that grid, right? That grid's the bane of my existence. I poured over the NIST standard, I read it 3 or 4 times, and I said, the only non-cell phone based solution that doesn't involve a YubiKey that costs $7 a piece, which is also cost prohibitive in the retail industry, particularly we got people who are coming and going on a weekly basis and there's high turnover and high loss. I said, let's get these grids, right? We can print out the grid, we can stick it behind this person's badge, and we'll use that as a strong second factor for MFA for these users. And the answer was every single vendor that I went to, and I said, I love NIST. I want MFA 2.0. I want a grid. They said, you're the only one who's asking for this. This is not on our roadmap. No other customer has asked for this. Why do you want it? We explained it. Well, we'll see how it goes. So that's why I'm doing this talk today. I want you as the customers, you as the system integrators, you as the vendors, if you've showed up since the beginning of the talk, to think about strong MFA and how to provide solutions that work without a cell phone, right? So let's talk about some other challenges other than we can't require all of our users to have a cell phone. If they have one, it's great, but we need a solution that'll work for everybody, right? So the second largest area, the other gap that I found, is in this identity proofing, temporary factor, bootstrapping scenario, right? I was thinking about it in the enterprise commercial space. It really also exists in the B2C space as well, right? So how do we securely bring on that second factor, right? If all I have is a username and a password, how do I bootstrap that user in a secure way? So I thought it was really interesting at the keynote last night, and I took some notes. So Brad was on stage, and he was really talking about trying to solve this bootstrap identity proofing problem. How do we do it in a scalable way? How do we do it in a way that's cost effective? And this involves all of these scenarios, like I left my factor at home. How do I get a good, strong second factor? I really wanted to go to the login.gov session yesterday because I signed up for login.gov this week. And I was extremely excited that before it let me continue on, it required me to copy down a strong recovery password. Because I'm thinking to myself, these guys understand it. They know that loss factor is a huge problem, and they're going to require me to copy that value down and reuse it, right? I put up a little grid here. I'm going to leave it on the screen for us to think about, right, in terms of the things that I've talked about. Let's stop accepting MFA 1.0. Let's start demanding MFA 2.0. My bank for my company, for Orcas, spent millions of dollars upgrading their website in the last few months. Brand new website, brand new ACH integration. I sign up, and the first thing they do is they send me an SMS code, right? So here's a financial company with a huge amount of risk to mitigate, and they're still using MFA 1.0. So let's not do that. I've got about a minute and a half or 2 minutes. Do we have any questions? And the gentleman who says, what about not having a cell phone?
So I'm going to end my question.
Okay. And I'll repeat the question, so.
The issue is not the factor. The issue is operationalizing the factor.
I agree.
Get someone in another country.
Right. So he said. So we're talking about not using a cell phone. That the issue is not how strong is the factor, but how to operationalize distributing securely and tracking that factor. And I agree with the gentleman. And I went to every MFA vendor out there. I said, I have a customer. They want to buy. They do not want to build. They need to have a workflow that lets them securely bootstrap a second factor when that employee is at home and or left their cell phone at home, or like my wife did the other week, destroyed the battery in her cell phone and her phone was down for 5 days. How do we go from no factor to alternate factor or secure second factor? And none of the vendors that I talked to had any of those workflows or any of those tools in their product. So again, this is a challenge not only to us as customers to be better, but to the industry to be better about providing those workflows. Do you have a question?
No, it was just a comment on what you were saying.
Okay, so let me see if I can restate. Yeah, absolutely. Let me see if I can say it back to you and if I got it right. So really, it's about, particularly in the financial world, knowing your customer and being able to have enough data shared between the two of you to begin that relationship and that journey. Or to get the data and have it. And unfortunately, guys, I'm out of time, but I am here all night tonight. I am here all day tomorrow. Feel free to grab me in a hall and let's keep talking about MFA 2.0.